985 AD, the North Atlantic. Waves the size of buildings, wind chill pushing past -40. 32 men crammed into one open wooden boat with no walls, no roof, and no fire. Not a single flame for 18 days straight. By every rule survival science has ever written down, these men should have been dead by day 2. Almost all of them lived. And the reason isn't toughness, it isn't luck. It's a system, a real engineered system. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand it better than most historians did 50 years ago, because the last piece of it has nothing to do with the ship at all. Let me ask you something before we start. If you were building a boat to cross the deadliest ocean on the planet, what's the first thing you'd put on it? Some kind of heat source, right? A stove, a cabin, a fireplace, anything. The Vikings had none of it. And we don't have to guess about that, because we've actually found the boats. The Gokstad ship, pulled out of a burial mound in Norway back in 1880, is 23 meters long and 5 meters wide. Picture a tennis court, but shrunk down until it's barely wider than a minivan. Now try to fit 35 men into that space, along with their weapons, their food, their trade goods, their rowing gear. How much room is actually left per person? Not much. Barely enough to stretch your legs out. And the whole thing is open. No deck overhead, no enclosed cabin below. The sidewalls rise about a meter above the waterline, and that is the entire barrier between the crew and the ocean. Every wave that breaks over the bow lands directly on the men inside. Every gust of wind reaches them with absolutely nothing in the way. Now, here's where the numbers get serious. Winter surface water temperatures in those seas hover around 2 degrees Celsius. Air temperature regularly drops to -20. Add wind chill, and it gets far worse than that. At those levels, exposed skin can start suffering frostbite in under 10 minutes. And here's a number worth sitting with for a second. Modern hypothermia research shows that a person immersed in 2-degree water loses consciousness in under 15 minutes. You don't slowly get cold in water like that. You just shut down. And even without falling in, prolonged exposure to sub-zero wind on an open vessel drains your core body temperature hour after hour. Left unchecked, it kills you, slowly and quietly, long before anyone even notices what's happening. So why not just light a fire? Think about what these ships were actually built from. Pine and oak planks, stacked and overlapped, sealed with tarred animal hair, rope, wool, and sailcloth treated in animal fat. Every single surface on that ship is flammable. The hull itself flexes with every wave that hits it. One spark catches, one ember rolls into the wrong corner, and the vessel that's supposed to keep you alive becomes the thing that kills you. And the Vikings understood this better than almost anyone alive today. Fire was central to everything they did on land. Every longhouse had a hearth burning through the night all year round. Their avoidance of fire at sea wasn't some kind of oversight or a sign they hadn't figured it out yet. It was a calculated decision made by people who understood shipbuilding and combustion well enough to know exactly what an open flame would do to a windswept, flexing wooden hull in the middle of the ocean. So that's the real question this video is going to answer. How do you keep 30 men alive for weeks on an open wooden platform floating on top of a freezing ocean in sub-zero wind without the one survival tool humans have relied on for something like 400,000 years? No fire. None. And the answer isn't a single clever trick. It's a system built from several layers, and every single one of those layers is more impressive than the last. But before we get into it, I want to kill a myth, because this is where most retellings of Viking history go completely wrong. There's this popular image of Vikings as hard men who just gritted their teeth and endured whatever the ocean threw at them. Tough guys surviving tough conditions through sheer willpower. That is not what happened, not even close. What the archaeology actually shows is closer to the opposite. Every element of how these people handled cold at sea was calculated. Deliberate material choices, layered insulation principles that match what we teach in outdoor survival courses today. An understanding of how heat moves through fabric, wood, and human bodies that formal science wouldn't get around to properly describing for another 800 years. These were not men who simply endured the cold. These were engineers who systematically removed it from the equation, layer by layer, and what they built tells us far more about Viking intelligence than any saga ever written down. So let's start with the layer closest to the body, what actually touched their skin. Wool. But not the wool you're picturing right now, and definitely not the soft, processed stuff you'd find in a store today. Norse sheep produced what's called a dual-coat fleece. There was an outer layer of long, coarse guard hairs called tog, and an inner layer of dense, fine fibers called fell. Put those two together, and you get something remarkable. Water-resistant on the outside, heat-trapping on the inside, built right into the structure of the fiber itself before anyone even started spinning it into thread. But here's the detail that changes everything, and it's the part almost nobody expects. The Vikings hardly ever washed their wool. Not out of laziness, not out of ignorance about hygiene. They mostly just rinsed it in cold seawater. And I know that sounds unpleasant, maybe even a little disgusting by modern standards, but it wasn't a mistake. It was genuinely clever, because skipping the harsh wash meant the wool kept its lanolin, the natural waxy oil that comes straight from the sheep's skin. Lanolin is hydrophobic. It actively repels water. Even today, a lanolin-rich tunic won't soak up rain or drizzle. The water just runs right off it, the same way it would run off a duck's feathers. And we're not just speculating about any of this. Textile fragments recovered from the Birka burial site in Sweden and the Oseberg burial site in Norway back this up directly. Tight, dense weaves. Diamond twill patterns specifically designed to trap heat and block wind. Researchers at the National Museum of Denmark actually tested recreated Viking garments using historically accurate wool and processing methods, and what they found was remarkable. Even when soaking wet, these garments retained 80% of their insulation capacity. 80%. Sit with that for a second. Because modern synthetic base layers, the ones marketed to soldiers and mountaineers and sold at premium prices, lose a significant chunk of their insulating power the moment they get wet. Viking wool just kept working, wet or dry, in freezing wind or driving sea spray. Now, there's a genuine debate among historians here, and I think it's worth mentioning because it's actually interesting. Some scholars argue this was essentially accidental, that the Vikings simply used whatever their sheep produced, and it happened to work well. Others argue the evidence points toward deliberate textile engineering, refined and passed down across generations of trial and error at sea, tweaked and improved the same way any technology gets improved when people's lives depend on it. Accident or mastery? Honestly, I lean toward mastery, but it's a genuinely open question, and I'd love to hear which side you land on in the comments, because the archaeologists themselves don't fully agree. On top of that base layer, the system built upward. First, a garment called a linen, a light undergarment made of fine wool or linen worn directly against the skin. Over that, a heavier woolen tunic called a kirtle, and over that, a thick outer cloak, often treated with tallow or beeswax for extra water resistance, the Viking equivalent of a waterproof shell jacket. Each layer created a pocket of trapped air between itself and the layer above it, and that trapped air is doing most of the actual insulating work, the same way a down jacket keeps you warm, not because of the feathers themselves, but because of the still air those feathers trap.
And here's the connection that really puts this in perspective. Walk into any outdoor gear store today, and you will see this exact same system being sold back to you at a significant markup. An inner layer for moisture management, a mid-layer for insulation, a shell layer for wind and water protection. 3 layers, 3 distinct functions, each one doing a specific job. This is modern mountaineering science, developed in laboratories, tested in wind tunnels, engineered with synthetic polymers that didn't exist 100 years ago. And the Vikings arrived at the exact same underlying principle using sheep, hand looms, and roughly 1,000 years of trial and error crossing the North Atlantic. The engineering logic is identical, only the materials have changed. The real difference, of course, comes down to price. Back then, a Viking wool tunic cost roughly the same as a silver bracelet. A modern 3-layer technical system, on the other hand, is expensive enough to make you seriously reconsider your life choices while you're standing in line waiting to pay for it. But clothing only manages heat loss from the body itself. You're still sitting inside a thin wooden shell, floating on an ocean that sits just a couple of degrees above freezing. And the cold doesn't only come from the air around you, it radiates upward, through everything your body is in contact with, the deck, the hull, the bench you're sitting on. This is the part that most popular retellings of Viking seafaring completely skip over. The ship itself was functioning as thermal protection, not just as a vehicle. Norse clinker construction, that overlapping plank technique that's basically a Scandinavian signature, means each plank overlaps the one directly below it, riveted together and sealed with tarred wool or animal hair. This design was primarily built for flexibility. A clinker-built hull flexes with the waves instead of fighting against them, which is exactly why longships could survive seas that would split a rigid, fixed hull clean in half. But that overlapping structure did something else at the same time, almost as a side effect. Each overlap trapped a thin pocket of still air between the planks, all along the interior of the hull. Individually, each one of those pockets is basically meaningless, tiny, and insignificant. But collectively, running the entire length of the ship, they created a continuous buffer of still air between the crew and the freezing ocean, sitting just centimeters away on the other side of the wood. Add in loose wool packed into the hull's interior gaps as filling, and you've got another insulating layer stacked on top of that. Was any of this dramatic? No, not even close. But survival engineering almost never works in dramatic leaps. It works in small, stacked increments. When you're trying to stay on the right side of the line where your body starts to fail, every fraction of a degree actually matters. And these small margins add up to something that can genuinely make the difference between a crew that survives and a crew that doesn't. Now let's talk about wind, because what comes next is a strategy so simple it almost sounds too obvious, right up until you realize modern navies took centuries to arrive at the exact same conclusion independently. The Norse used their sail as more than just a way to catch wind and move the ship forward. Saga accounts, along with experimental archaeology, especially the Skuldelev ship reconstruction sailed out of Denmark back in the 1990s, show that crews would reposition the sail specifically as a windbreak whenever conditions turned bad. They'd lower it partially and angle it across the beam of the ship, not for speed, but purely for shelter. Some accounts go even further. describing spare sailcloth rigged up over the midsection of the ship as a kind of makeshift canopy. Not a cabin, nothing close to that, but just enough fabric to block the direct blast of Arctic wind from hitting the crew at full force. The material of choice for this was wad mal, a thick, dense, tightly woven wool fabric. It blocked wind effectively while still allowing enough airflow through it to prevent dangerous condensation from building up underneath, which is actually a subtle and important detail, because trapping moisture against your body in freezing conditions can be just as dangerous as the wind itself. And here's why all of this matters more than you might initially think. Reducing wind speed across exposed skin by 50% can double the amount of time before hypothermia sets in. Double it. That is not a small number. That is the difference between a survivable crossing and a fatal one. The Norse didn't learn this from a textbook, obviously, because no such textbook existed yet. They learned it from centuries of direct observation, watching what kept men alive and what didn't, and adjusting their methods accordingly, generation after generation. If you've ever been out on open water in genuinely bad weather, or spent a night in an exposed position with wind cutting straight through your clothing, you already know exactly what one solid windbreak can do for you. The difference between wind hitting your bare face directly and wind being blocked by even a single thin barrier isn't a minor comfort improvement. It changes whether you can think clearly. It changes whether your hands still work well enough to grip an oar or tie a knot. It changes whether you can keep going another hour or whether you start to shut down. Some of you watching this already know exactly what I'm describing from personal experience, and if that's you, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments below. Now we get to the most sophisticated part of this entire system, and honestly, the most human part of it too. Viking crews didn't sleep alone, spread out across the deck, fending for themselves individually. They slept in organized groups, packed into shared sleeping bags called Hudfat. These were large sacks made from walrus hide or seal hide, with the fur turned inward, facing the body. Each one typically held 2 to 3 men at once. The hide blocked wind and water from the outside. The fur trapped warmth on the inside. And the men packed inside, quite literally, were the heat source. This wasn't some kind of improvised, thrown-together solution. The Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red both mention Hudfat specifically, listing them as standard equipment, every bit as essential to a voyage as the sail or the oars. You simply did not set out on a North Atlantic crossing without them, the same way you wouldn't set out without oars or without a rudder. Archaeological evidence recovered from Norse settlements in Greenland has also uncovered fragments of hide sacks consistent with exactly these descriptions from the sagas. This was real, planned equipment, built and maintained with the same seriousness as any other piece of the ship. Here's how the actual system worked in practice. Crews rotated through shifts, rowing, then standing watch, then resting. The sleeping sacks were almost never empty, and as a direct result, they were almost never cold either. A man coming off a 4-hour rowing shift, his body still pumping out serious metabolic heat from all that physical exertion, would climb straight into a Hudfat that was still warm from whoever had used it just before him. Meanwhile, the man he was replacing would take over at the oars, already rested and already warmed up from his own time inside the sack. Think about how efficient that actually is. No heat produced by a human body was ever wasted, sitting in a cold sack going unused. No sack ever sat there, losing all its warmth to the freezing air around it. The rotation itself became the engine that kept the whole heating system continuously running, hour after hour, day after day. Now ask yourself, how much actual heat are we talking about here? A resting human body produces roughly 80 watts of thermal energy, just sitting there doing nothing. Put 2 men into one sealed hide sack together, and you're generating around 160 watts, which is roughly comparable to a large, old-fashioned light bulb. In a space about the size of a coffin, with wind and water almost completely blocked by thick animal hide, interior temperatures inside that sack could climb somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees above the outside air temperature. That's not comfort, not by any modern definition of the word, but it is absolutely survival, and it comes down to pure, straightforward physics. And there's one more thing the Hudfat did that had nothing to do with temperature at all. It kept men psychologically intact. In total darkness, in freezing wind, in conditions that could genuinely break a person's will to keep going, the physical closeness of another human body was a constant, tangible reminder that you were not alone out there, that the crew around you was still intact, that the system everyone depended on was still holding together. It's easy to overlook that part when you're only thinking about the physics, but it mattered just as much as the heat itself. Now, the level of comfort here, it has to be said, was well below what any of us would consider tolerable. Imagine rowing for 30 straight hours out on the open ocean, living on a diet of dried cod and fermented fish, and then crawling into a damp sealskin sack alongside 2 other men who have been doing exactly the same grueling work you have. And then there's the smell. If the Norse had ever put together recruitment posters for these crossings, whoever got assigned to write the honest description of conditions inside a Hudfat would have absolutely earned hazard pay for that job. But here's the underlying truth buried inside all of that discomfort. Shared body heat is not some fringe theory or a piece of folklore. It is one of the oldest, most consistently proven survival techniques known to the human species, tested and retested across cultures and across centuries. If you've ever huddled inside a bivouac sack on a mountain, spent a night in a foxhole during military service, or gone through cold water survival training of any kind, you already know it works, because you've felt it work firsthand. And if that memory just flashed through your mind while I was describing this, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. Here's what almost never makes it into the popular version of this story, and honestly, it might be the most impressive layer of the entire system. The Vikings didn't just manage the cold while they were out on the ship. They managed their entire route in advance, specifically to minimize how much exposure to that cold they'd have to deal with in the first place. Archaeological surveys have identified more than 200 Viking-age harborage sites strung along the Norwegian coastline alone. These weren't random spots where ships happened to occasionally stop. They were genuine infrastructure, deliberately positioned roughly a day's sailing distance apart from one another, sheltered bays where crews would beach their ships, light fires on solid ground, cook hot food, dry out soaked clothing, and let their bodies fully recover their core temperature before pushing on to the next waypoint along the coast. The longest open water crossing anywhere in the Viking world, from Norway all the way to Iceland, covered roughly 900 nautical miles. At the average speed of a longship under sail, that works out to somewhere between 4 and 6 days of continuous exposure with no harbor stop along the way. And the Norse overwhelmingly chose to sail that particular crossing in summer, from late May through August, when daylight stretched past 20 hours a day and air temperatures stayed within a survivable range for the entire voyage. When winter sailing genuinely couldn't be avoided, they hugged the coastline instead, moving in short hops from harbor to harbor, never pushing further than the system they'd built could actually handle. Consider what all of this means once you put the whole picture together. The Viking survival system wasn't just clever wool and hide and shared body heat, as impressive as all of that already is on its own. It was a logistical network, spanning literally thousands of miles of coastline, built around harbors, seasonal timing, careful route selection, and weather knowledge passed down through oral tradition from one generation of sailors to the next, It was a maritime infrastructure that the rest of Western Europe simply wouldn't manage to match for roughly another 500 years. That's not survival instinct, and it's not luck either. That's the architecture of a civilization that understood the sea and everything the sea could do to a human body, better than almost anyone else on Earth at the time. So step back for a second and look at the entire system as a whole. These men crossed some of the most dangerous water on the planet in open wooden boats. No engines, no weather satellites tracking the next storm system days in advance. No thermal gear engineered in a laboratory using material science that didn't exist yet. What they had, instead, was a system. Wool that it took modern science literal centuries to meaningfully improve on. Ship design that doubled as functioning thermal architecture, built into the very structure of the hull itself. Sleeping arrangements that effectively turned human bodies into rotating heating units, running continuously through a rotating shift system. And a logistics network stretching across the entire North Atlantic, built from harbors and timing and generations of accumulated knowledge about exactly when and where it was safe to sail. None of it was accidental. Every single layer was the product of generations of knowledge, tested at sea, refined through repetition, and ultimately paid for in human lives when the system failed and lessons had to be learned the hard way. The wool wasn't random. The ship design wasn't a coincidence. The Hudfat weren't some desperate improvised measure thrown together out of necessity. And the harbor network definitely wasn't luck. It was all one interconnected system, designed by people who understood their environment with a level of precision that, honestly, we're still catching up to in a lot of ways even today. They weren't survivors in the way we usually use that word, people who simply got lucky and made it through by chance. They were engineers of survival, full stop, and every single crossing they made was a calculated operation, planned and executed with the same seriousness you'd expect from any modern expedition. So the next time you turn up the heating in your house on a cold night, without even thinking twice about it, consider this for a moment. 1,000 years ago, men crossed genuinely Arctic seas with nothing but wool, animal hide, and each other's body heat standing between them and death. And every single piece of the system they built to survive that ocean still holds up as genuinely sound engineering today. If this is the kind of history you actually come here for, not horned helmets, not Hollywood raid scenes, but a real, honest look at how these people thought, and how they solved problems that nobody else on Earth had figured out at the time, then stick around, because this channel is exactly for you. There's a lot more of this story still to tell.